This is the largest by far diorama that I've had an opportunity to work on. This was a great experience. In fact, it was so large I had to separate it into 3 different sections, which are then modular and can be oriented in any way you deem fit. But more importantly, it was so much fun to just create. I was able to use all the techniques and the skills I've shown off in my earlier videos, such as dry brushing, airbrushing, creating textures with tile grout and sand. Plus, I was able to include a lot of 3D printed elements I sourced online from other awesome artists. So if you're interested in seeing how this diorama was created, well, you've come to the right place. Let's start part 1 of 2 of the Imperial Rust diorama. Hey everyone, I'm Desi, and you're watching Crafted by Metamorphic Customs. In this episode, which is actually a 2-parter, we'll be building a rather large Star Wars Imperial diorama, or an Imperial entrance as some like to call it. I'm going to be using a few 3D files which I was able to source online from a great artist that goes by the name Masasi. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Hope I haven't butchered that. But I'll write the name down in the video description below, as well as provide links as to where you may be able to find these files, which, as you can see, I've already 3D printed here, and I'm starting to paint. What I've done is I 3D printed the individual 6-scale components, and I primed them using a basic rattle can spray paint from Home Depot. In this case, I primed them with a silver coat. And now using a airbrush with black paint, any hobby black paint that you can put through an airbrush will do here. And I'm using the black paint to generally give it some shading and some coating, whatever looks right. No patterns here. I am focusing on some of the recesses, if there are recesses, and where there's no recesses, just giving it some shade to make it look like old, worn piping. And this black paint I'm applying, you could do this with a regular brush. It doesn't have to be an airbrush. You can either use a dry brushing technique or just simply paint it on. I'm using an airbrush because it's faster and I'm used to using it and I have it handy. But if you're on the fence about picking up an airbrush for your hobbies, seriously pick one up. It's great. It will really change your work, either from appearance or just speed. You'll be able to work through things a lot faster. That's my opinion, of course, but I definitely recommend it. My next step here is to actually do a dry brush, and this I'm not going to do with an airbrush because this you need to be able to see the dry brush technique. So I'm using a 1.5 inch brush, I believe that's what it was, and I'm just dry brushing on cheap hobby silver paint. Any silver will do. I think I went with a brighter silver here just so that it can really show now that I've painted the shadows in a dark black or the grime in a dark black, whatever you want to call it. So again, I'm just dry brushing this with a silver paint. And if you recall, dry brushing is just putting some paint on your brush, just a tiny bit of paint, and then if necessary, cleaning most of that paint off on a piece of paper towel before applying it to whatever you're painting. And the point there is to get these brush strokes that are left behind, which you can see, which will appear like scratches on the piece and just wear and tear over time. I'm going to do the same thing on this other component, which I've also printed out. And this component was primed in a rust red. And that's from a spray can or a rattle can, whatever you call it, that I got at my local Home Depot. Feel free to pick up spray paints. They're great, especially for priming or base coating parts. And pick them up at your local hardware store. So after I prime that, what I'm doing is using, like I said, the same dry brush technique with a 1.5 inch brush and some cheap silver hobby paint. It's important to really get that dry brush technique here. I want this to look old, worn, and weathered because you guys know I love weathering if you've seen any of my previous videos. This really brings this to life. By the way, if you're enjoying the content, you like the videos, and you find it either helpful or just entertaining, go ahead and like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. It lets me know that, well, you're enjoying the content that's being put out. And let me once again say that these 3D components here, again, that I've printed out are awesome. I'm really glad that these are available online. I was able to download them, and again, there are some just great artists that first of all, they model 3D files and they make them available via various online sites and platforms, and you can download these and just print them out and make your own dioramas with them. This component here, I have no idea what this is. It looks like some kind of AC unit or something along those lines, but it looks pretty cool. So I've primed this in a basic white, matte white primer. Again, a spray can, rattle can, and I'm using the same dry brush technique here, once again, to make this look really worn and weathered. And yet another 3D printed component. Again, I have no idea what this is, but it looks cool. It's like some kind of bell shape or something. And again, all these components came from the same group file that was modeled by this artist, Masashi, who makes his files available for download via various online sites and platforms. Again, he does great work and it produces great 3D printed parts. And what I'm doing here is reapplying some black paint via my airbrush, basically doing the same thing I did before, but I want to make sure I didn't go too far with the silver dry brushing, which I feel I may have done here. So I want to make sure I hit the recesses again. I really want that old weathered look to come through in the final piece, so that's why I'm going back and doing this one more time. And I'm doing the same with this component here. This one was also primed that red rust color before and then dry brushed with the silver. And now I'm adding the shading, grime, whatever you choose to call it, with the black paint through an airbrush. And all the painting I'm doing here on these initial 3D components is just really what I like to call the prep, or maybe the base paints before I incorporate them into the eventual diorama. Again, I'm adding the black paint here, the shade, and the grime to this component here. I think this is called a heater. I don't know how this is a heater, but hey, it's a heater. So anyways, I'm adding the dark areas, and again, this is all what I call like a base paint or a pre-paint before I add the components to the diorama. Once the components are in the diorama much later on, I'm also going to go back and weather them further with rust and some subtle shading here with sepia tones and brown tones. This is just the base colors that primary is the wrong word, but just the initial coloring. It's much easier to paint this now with these base colors or this base paint and base weathering rather than try to do this later once the components are in the diorama. And you'll see that. You'll see that as I slowly start to add these to the diorama later on. And here, just adding the same black paint to this. We'll call this the AC unit, as I mentioned before. Again, I don't know if it's an AC or not, but I don't know, cool looking greebly, if you will, for this diorama. And I'll be doing the same process overall to this component, which is also 3D printed. I believe this is known as antennas. I'm going to do this on 3 different antennas because that's how many I printed, as you can see here on your screen, but I'm only going to end up using 2. I figured I would only use 2, but I made 3 just in case there was room. But at the end, I didn't really need the 3, I just needed the 2. And I primed this using a dark gray, which again, that was a spray can or rattle can. Then I hit it with some shadows from the black paint through an airbrush. Now I'm dry brushing with silver, much like I did the other components. And then I'll probably come back with an airbrush and hit it again with some black paint and make sure I didn't go too far with this dry brush silver look. And again, this dry brushing really gives this nice worn, scratched look. And it's fun to apply. One of my favorite things to do when applying paint. And now to move on to the door. The door comes in 3 separate components: the actual base door, which you see me holding now and painting, the small side door section, which is off there to the right there. It's a thin component. You'll see that goes off to the left of the door, and then the actual door frame. These are all 3D printed, just like the other components you've seen thus far in this video. So what I've done is I went ahead and I primed this door in this blue teal color. Again, I picked what I thought would be good from the available spray paints at my local hardware store. In my case, it was Home Depot. And I just painted these components. And I chose this color because the end door is this blue-green, I guess dark teal color. So I started with this light teal color so that I can build up the dark areas and then maybe come back light a little bit with some weathering. But what I'm doing now with the airbrush is I'm using an almost black paint. Really what it is, it's a very dark blue mixed with a very dark green to make that blue, very dark blue-green color. But you could have used black if you were doing something like this, because I'm just going in and putting in the shade, much like I did in the other components thus far. As you can see, I've gone fairly dark here, and that's on purpose because I'm going to come back and weather this just like all the other components, but this one's going to be weathered to look faded and stained by time. So I'm going to come back with lighter tones here when I do the weathering, and some bright silver chips as well. So that's why I'm going dark. I'm going to come back and start going a little lighter here and there, but I need to build up this dark base, or this dark shade on top of that primer color. Looks pretty good. Speaking of weathering and staining, I've watered down a very, very light teal color, almost this baby blue color, and I'm just applying it and layering it over and over. So I'll apply it with a brush, as you can see, kind of just dab it on there. And then I might come back and pull some of that paint off with either my hands, using my fingers, or a paper towel. And the point is, every time I do that, it leaves some staining, what looks like staining behind, and that creates a great weathered look. This is a great technique no matter what type of paint you're using, whether it's acrylics like the ones I'm using here. These are water-based acrylics. This also works really well with oil or enamel-based paints. I usually work in water-based paints because it's easier, or cleanup's easier. It's less toxic usually, but this works well with many different types of paints. And it really just gives a great effect at the end of the day. Yeah, you have to have some patience because it's all about layering, right? Doing this just once really won't look as great. It'll look okay, but it won't look as great. You got to come back in each area and do this a few times. You know, put the paint on again, kind of wipe it off with your hands with a paper towel, and then come back and do the same. And after you do this several times in several areas, it's awesome. Can't say enough about this technique. And you guys can probably figure out what I'm doing here. Same thing I've done for all the other components. Just dry brushing some silver paint just to catch those edges, especially on this door frame, which has those ridges or those rectangular cutouts there. It's going to look nice. So it'll look worn. Again, you'll hear me say that word, worn, weathered, grimy, many times throughout this video, because that is the point, and that is what we're going for with this diorama. And I'm going to do the same on the door. Again, focusing on the edges. I want to make sure that those edges catch the silver paint on the brush during this dry brushing process. And by the way, you can see what the different layers of that dried, watered down teal paint looks like. No secrets here, really. It's just applying that watered down teal paint over and over. You apply it, remove it, rinse and repeat, and after a while you get this effect, which I think looks pretty cool. Now I'm coming back with a small brush and adding little silver chips along the edges and maybe some lines to represent some deeper scratches. Again, the goal is to make it look as worn as possible. I'll also add some of that light teal paint with the small brush under some of the chips and paints. So if I painted a silver chip, for example, I'll come back with this lighter teal and a brush, and I'll apply the light teal as a line, kind of outlining the chipped teal. This gives a 3D effect and just makes it look nice. I'll also do the same under any black chips that may show up from the weathering. I'll just add a little bit of teal, lighter teal paint under it. And again, this creates a 3D effect. Makes the chips that I've painted on look 3D. Most of my videos are sped up for time. I think that's always been pretty evident, and that's no exception here with this video. But I've left a lot of the door painting footage in here because I really wanted to show this process and the level of detail that I like to take my pieces to really make them stand out. Sometimes they're overly detailed, but it's always something that I've enjoyed doing when painting anything, when painting a model, making an actual painting, but it's a great and fun process. And now I'm going to call that done, and I'm going to start adding components to the actual diorama backdrop, which is made of, guess what? XPS foam, right? One of the best materials to use. And I will continue using this because it is just great. I've put down a weight on the left and a can of WD-40 because I didn't have a second weight handy. So I'm using these as weights to keep the door frame from caving in on itself because it's still fairly soft resin. Keep the door frame from caving in on itself as I trace the exterior. And then I'm gonna have to cut this out once I'm done tracing it. And I should say again that this diorama is one of the larger ones I've made. All in all, it's going to be about 44 or 45 inches wide by about 22.5 inches deep and 19 inches tall. But that width, which is 45 inches wide, that's pretty wide. So I'm going to make this in 3 different components. The component you'll see me working on now is the center component, which has the door. And I'm going to use a 2-part clear epoxy to start adhering these larger components that I think may not hold together well if I just use hot glue. I love using 2-part clear epoxy because it will not melt the XPS foam like super glue will. So that's important. So I've made, as you saw, I traced out the door frame and I've made space for this door. Now I've glued the door just to the rim of that exterior XPS frame. Now I'm going to glue the door frame on top of the door and also to the XPS frame, XPS foam frame. And again, using a 2-part clear epoxy. And that's Gorilla brand epoxy. I really like that brand for both their epoxy and for their super glue. So gluing this last component of the door in, and that's already looking great. I think that door looks pretty good. I'm very thankful for the 3D model from Masashi. Again, it's great. And what I'm doing here, by the way, there is a hole on the top of that door frame to allow for a light to be added, an LED light, which I will do. And I'm cutting out a section there to fit the LED lights later on. You'll see me do that. I'm going to pre-rig those lights for the top of the door and for the door panel, and then you'll see me actually glue in the rig later on. So I'm just making small cuts here, making a wide enough area, and there's going to be another huge section of XPS foam that goes over this area. It's going to go around the door frame. So this will be covered, but it'll leave a wonderful, nice area that I can put the LED lights in later. And now, allow me to show you the lights I was referring to. These are the pre-rigged lights. As you can see, they work. It's 6 individual smaller lights and 2 bright LED lights. These are the 6 individual colored lights, 2 in yellow, we've got 1 in green, 1 red, 1 slow blinking yellow, and then the last one, which is a fast blinking RGB party light, as I like to call it. These 6 lights will go in the door panel on the right of the door. And then it's got the main big lights that will be above the door. Speaking of which, before I install these, I gotta make holes for all of the lights to go through. I've already made a hole at the top of the door where all these wires will be nestled in. But now I gotta make a hole for the LED door panel, as well as a hole for the greeting droid, which is not lit. Greeting droid is not lit, but I'll make a hole for that now. And what's going to help here is burning XPS foam and burning channels for the lights, but always use a mask. This mask is a little intensive, but I like to protect my eyes, not just my breathing. So always use a mask when burning foam. And I'm using an old soldering iron. This is not the soldering iron I use to rig all the lights or do any actual soldering, but I use an old soldering iron just to burn foam. And again, while I'm doing this, I've got my window open and I'm wearing that mask to protect myself from the fumes. That is very, very important. These fumes are not good for you, so wear a mask. But this is what I'm doing on the underside of that XPS cover that will again go in front of the, or I shouldn't say in front of, but around the door frame that's on my left here, on the left of the screen. This channel will allow me to glue in all the wiring harnesses that will light up the top of the door, as well as the panel on the right side of the door. Right now it's on the left. See that hole on the left? well, this will be flipped around and placed over or around the door frame on your left. But it's important to build or to carve out this channel. And yes, you can absolutely carve out this channel with a knife. It's just a lot faster if you just burn it out. If you've got a mask, you've got an old soldering iron, give it a shot. If not, do it with a blade very carefully. Now's a good time too to bring up the dimensions, which I previously gave. I mentioned was 44 inches long, the entire diorama, and then that's cut into 3 smaller sections. But I wanted to mention that I didn't mention the individual sizes of the 3 sections or the sizes of this XPS foam we're seeing right now, because it's really not that important. I printed the 3D components and I'm really just cutting XPS foam to fit around it. Really, it doesn't really matter all that much. You could make this diorama a lot shorter. See all that length I have on top of the door frame there? You can make it shorter, you can make it skinnier so it's not as wide, right? It doesn't really matter. That's why I haven't measured or mentioned the measurements of these individual XPS components. And I'm still carving out some areas here to make sure everything fits. The door panel up there on the right hand side of the door, and now this bottom area is just to fit the end where all the wires come together and will actually come out through the other end of the XPS foam so that they can actually connect to the power adapter. This top ring is actually for the greeting droid, which again is not powered, doesn't have any LEDs here, but it provides a nice rim for that droid to come out of the wall or appear as if it's coming out of the wall. And I just hot glued this in. It's a small component, should hold perfectly fine. So before I actually glue the components, I should say the wiring harness in, and before I glue this cover over the door frame, I'm going to paint the carved out sections in this opaque black acrylic paint. And that is to prevent any light bleed. So I don't want light bleeding out through the edges here or coming out anywhere where it's not supposed to show, because then it'll completely break the illusion of the diorama. So just in case, I shouldn't have any light bleed, but it doesn't hurt. This is cheap black paint. Might as well paint in those areas directly around where the LEDs will be adhered. And once I'm done with that, I'm going to feed this wiring harness, which I previously showed you, through that first hole, which is the door panel hole. And then I'm going to feed the door panel. First of all, I'm going to glue or apply hot glue there, then I will feed the door panel in. Once that's in, I'm going to go towards the back of this XPS piece. I'm going to glue in the 2 lights, which you see here, which are going to be the lights above the door. These 2 LEDs are actually LEDs for car headlights, believe it or not. I wanted to make sure these were bright enough. So I'm just going to hot glue in the wire there so that it doesn't move. And I'm going to do the same all along the canal, this carved groove I've made for this wiring harness. And I'm going to do this all the way down to that bottom carved out square, and that bottom carved out square is where the end of the wiring harness will go, and it'll feed through this other square at the bottom I've made and all the way out through the back of this diorama section. Then I'll pull that adapter component out, and this is where the AC adapter will plug into. And now it's time to glue the backdrop components of the diorama, in other words the back wall, onto the foreground or onto the ground. And I'm going to use some hot glue to do that, and I'm going to make sure it has a perfect 90-degree angle. That's why I'm using this right angle. I want to make sure it's straight. And this is actually the section that's going to be on the left hand side of the door. which is also going to have this arc just for decorative purposes, really, and to break up the form, not just have it be an L-shaped diorama. So again, just want to make sure it's still angled there. That's why I'm using my right angle, and I'm gluing on this arc here. And I think that will work. Looks pretty straight. That's pretty much what I had envisioned. Not bad. This will be really the only arc in the entire diorama. I want to leave a lot of foreground room, well, to actually place some 6-scale figures here. That's the main focus, not the diorama. We're trying to make the diorama look nice, but we got to remember it's all about the figures. And this area here, this is actually the right section of the diorama, the section to the right of the door, or opposite of the last section. But again, using my right angle, I want to make sure this is straight. This back wall has a few more layers. And I'm going to do the same thing now with the actual door section. I'm applying some watered down PVA glue, Elmer's glue, if you're wondering what PVA glue is. And I'm also using a little bit of hot glue in sections just to make sure it holds, and the hot glue will instantly bond it, and then the much better PVA glue will dry over time and create an even better bond. But the goal here, again, put this down on the foreground or the ground, make sure it's at a good and perfect right angle, 90-degree angle, and we'll move forward from here. Remember that heater component? Well, we've assembled it along with the pipe that goes to its right, or its left, our right. And we're going to present it here on the right section of the diorama. And we're going to make a trace out the area where it's going to sit. It is connected to the ground at 2 spots, that middle thin tube and then the right large bell shape or a flared out shape it has at the bottom there. Trace those out, and I'm going to carve shallow grooves onto the ground of this XPS chunk here so that the heater sits inside the base just by maybe 1/8 of an inch shallow groove here. And this will allow for that heater component to be secure and not move around too much. The heater component is also, you can't see it here, but you'll see later on it's also glued to a pipe at the top. So it'll be secured at the bottom and it'll be secured at the top as well. And to carve out this round shape at the bottom, again, that's about 1/8 of an inch deep or thick. I'm just using an X-Acto blade. I make crisscross hatches within that circle that I've traced out, and then rip out enough foam that's about 1/8 of an inch thick, give or take, and just create a small little groove there in both circles, a small circle and the larger circle. Alright, now let's try that out. And that is near perfect. That's great. Okay, so that will fit perfectly, and that is exactly what we were going for. I'm not going to glue this just yet, but it was important to make sure we place this correctly here at this time. Speaking of, adding a couple of extra small pieces of XPS foam to this background to make sure I have the spacing between the wall and the pipe that will connect to the top of the heater just right. So just gluing this on with hot glue, a small piece of XPS foam, the hot glue should hold just fine. And this is that top portion of the pipe that holds the top of the heater. This will be glued to the top of the heater and also glued to the wall, securing it at the top. So I'm just going to trace out where this pipe, where the couplings will touch the wall, and that's what's going to be glued on to the XPS wall. I'll also have to trim the pipe a bit because it's way too long right now. So I'm kind of customizing these 3D components to fit the diorama I'm making. And once that's done, just check it out, and that's a perfect fit. Appears to be perfect fit, and it's glued. And again, I used hot glue to glue that on. And this will fit into the wall perfectly. Again, no need to glue down the heater permanently yet, but we know it fits, and it's got a tight fit, a tight squeeze there. So even now, without gluing that top component and without gluing the bottom of the heater, it doesn't really move, which is great. Good news. And I'm going to continue fitting in the 3D printed pipe components, which you saw me paint earlier. And I'm going to place these here, glue them in, they all connect, and interweave above each other. It looks pretty darn good, I gotta say. I'll also make holes to fit in the antenna components I mentioned earlier. The antenna components attached to the wall via 2 posts, if you will. So I'm making the holes for the post using my Dremel tool, and it's got a drill bit attached to it. I've marked out where the post would go, and I'm just using the Dremel to drill out the holes for it. I'm going about 1/2 inch thick here into the wall, and I've got more than enough space because the wall is at least 2 inches deep. That XPS, I used 2 pieces of XPS foam, which were each 1 inch deep, and I glued them to each other so that I know I have enough clearance and I can make these holes fairly deep. And it is 2 inches deep at the thinnest point of the wall, so not too bad. Gives me room to make holes and put things in the walls without coming out the back of it, which would not be good. And great fit. Again, we won't glue it in yet, but we know it fits perfectly. Let's go ahead and glue this small bell component, or whatever it is, we'll call it a bell. And hot glue, small component, perfect. And since I have my Dremel tool still handy here, I might as well use it to carve out some pieces of the wall here that have been exposed to weather and have just been crumbled or torn out, or maybe a projectile hit it. Point is, adds more weathering to the base wall. We don't want this to look perfectly clean. That is the opposite of what we're going for. So I'm just using this to carve out holes here wherever I think they look nice. Again, no pattern, no right or wrong way to do this. You can do this with a knife, but I had my Dremel tool handy, so I'm just using this. And I'm just using the drill bit that was in the Dremel tool. This works just fine for these purposes. And again, guys, don't forget to like and, more importantly, subscribe if you're enjoying this content. And then going over to the left section of this diorama, we're going to go ahead and glue the AC component. And this is going to look nice there. I'm also going to start gluing what appears to be an electrical box or some kind of wiring power area. Who knows what this is? But the point is, I'm going to start gluing this to the wall here. And based on where I think it would look great, I'm not really following the instructions too closely that came with the 3D components I downloaded. I am building them in the correct order here per those instructions, but not placing them in the right spot overall, because the measurements or dimensions of the diorama I'm making are a little different to what is expected when using these 3D components. that's a fun part. You can download 3D components, print them, print whatever sections you need, and then place them in an XPS or wood or whatever backing, however you want. That's exactly what I'm doing. And I'm going to open a small here with my Dremel, where I'm going to fit one end of the pipe section, which is going to end here. At least it'll end here for this section of the diorama. So this is the piping that goes along the top there. And that is perfect. So we'll just glue it in there, and that'll be perfect. And I'm going to open more holes here. This is for the other antenna. Remember, I printed out 3 and I painted 3. I'm only going to use 2 antennas. So the antennas, again, they connect via 2 posts to the back wall. So I'm opening up holes for those 2 posts, much like I did in the previous section I was just working on. And it's always good to check before we move on. Perfect. And again, I've got my Dremel handy. I might as well use it to carve out a couple of sections of the wall here, just for some added character. I'll also add some wooden dowels to this side, or to the left side of the arc. Right side of the arc or left side. I'm going to add 3 dowels here, and the idea is that I'm going to drape some cloth to make it look like a tarp covering this small section here, which we see tarps in places like Tatooine and Navarro on the Star Wars universe all the time. And since this will be a Star Wars diorama, it'll make some sense. Plus add a little color and flair to this section of the diorama. And again, same thing you've seen me do already. I'm going to carve out these holes using the drill bit on my Dremel. And using some hot glue, I'm going to go ahead and glue these wooden dowels in these post holes I've made. And that'll work perfectly. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video that focused on the construction of these 3 primary sections of the diorama. The next video, which is already done and coming very soon, will focus on the painting and final build. Until then, please like, subscribe, and remember, stay crafted.